Well, I guess I should start working my way through some of these Patreon reviews. I've got a number of them, and so this one's going to be the first one. This is to honor Matthew Caveat Zealot, and I believe that's how you pronounce his name. With his donation, he gets 3 album reviews, so this one's the first one, and I'm excited to talk about it, so let's dive in. Towers of Avarice by 0 Hour. So 0 Hour is an American progressive metal band. These guys came onto the scene in the late 90s, kind of dropping their first one in 2007, and they kind of self-released it, and it exploded to the point where they were signed for their second album, which is Tower of Avarice. I think that's how you pronounce it. I could be wrong. I've been diving into this album pretty hard since I've been listening to it last week. My overall impression of it is, at first I was very surprised that this came out in 2001. 2001 had a lot of really great albums. This was right around the time that, say, Metropolis and 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence were dropped. This was in and around the time that Avarice was dropped. One of my other thoughts, outside of just how advanced the music is, comparative to the rest of the music that was kind of offered at the time, is how long the album feels, even though it has a shorter runtime of only about 45 minutes. The album suites kind of blend into one another. There's only about 6 tracks on here. And the thing that kind of puts these guys ahead of some of their contemporaries, being like Symphony X and Dream Theater, and even some of the earlier guys like Fate's Warning and Queensryche, is their ability to maintain that brutality without being too in-your-face and bombastic. They also incorporate quite a lot of a theatrical presentation on there. The lead singer of Eric Rosvold reminds me of like Fish or an early Marillion, and this is seen a couple of times on the album, especially with the 4th track of Reflections and the 6th tracks of The Ghost of Dawn. Both of these songs are a little bit more on the intimate and somber side without being like melodramatic. You can definitely see that these guys have been influenced by Marillion, by Arena, and by even like Pendragon and IQ. Like that type of a theatrical presentation is definitely found within within this album and throughout it. And the part of that is also just the context of the album as well. This album is a concept album. It deals with an oppressive government within kind of an oligarchy, kind of akin to like the classic movie of like Metropolis, hence like Metropolis back there. With that presentation, you do have that raging against the machine. You have that expelling of emotions that have had to been repressed. So it does lend itself very well to that concept overall. Now the actual music that's found in here, as I mentioned, it does have a little bit of that melodramatics, it does have a little bit of that theatrical flair, but it's also kind of surrounding itself in a very interesting and complex musical presentation. When I was first listening to this album, I kind of listened to it without any context. I wanted to get in and just feel the music for what it was. Listening to it, I was like, man, this really feels like a Tool album, especially with how it starts off with the bass line of that title track of the Towers of Avarice, the first track. That first bass line feels very much like Schism from Tool, that I was just like, man, I wonder if these guys like practically ripped it off. But now realizing that Lateralis, the album that Schism is on, and Towers of Avarice came out at the same year, like at first I was going to rag on these guys for being like, oh man, you guys just stole off Tool. And this type of rhythm section is found throughout the album as well. It's very complex rhythm, it's very complex time signatures are playing throughout it. Towers of Avarice, as well as Statagem, as well as the 3rd track of Statagem. Both of these tracks have a very interesting and complex rhythm section that I was just diving in, and I'm like, this is what would have happened if, say, like a Dream Theater within that Metropolis era had gone more into that complex rhythm section of, say, a Tool. Blending these kind of 3 styles, the Dream Theater mythology, the Tool rhythm section, and then that theatrical presentation of, say, like Fish version of Marillion. This is what we're really getting into within this type of an album. Speaking of the vocals of Eric, he is channeling some really interesting things there with the overdubs and the harmonizations within himself. There's a part within that title track again where he's like slightly off harmonizing himself, and it feels very like automatic and very like, oh, and I'm just like diving in. I'm like, this is some really good stuff here. And this type of harmonization is also found within the second track of the Subterranean, and this is also harmonizing within the guitar work as well, where there's like this really strange type of a harmonization, almost like a Queen, but instead of where the Queen had been a very like pleasant harmonizing, this is like a very unpleasant, but it works very well within the concept of the album as well as the song overall. The one thing I will say though, as not necessarily like a knock against, but something I was very aware of, is that this album does get a little bit repetitive at times. I feel like when they're heavy, and they're kind of doing the same thing over and over again, and then when they're soft and melodramatic, again, they're doing that kind of same thing over and over again. And I don't feel like there's too much of a like an identity within the individual tracks. Like this album itself, it has an identity, but I don't know if it's quite as like solidified and as validating as I really want it to. And like there wasn't really any part on any of these tracks that either blew me away and like I was just like, yes, I need more of it, or there was like no real moment that identified itself as being a clear-cut great moment on there. This is just the inherent quality of this type of an album, where it's this kind of a concept, but at the same time I feel like they could have probably played around that a little bit more, had a little bit more of like a really meaty hook. And the only one that I could really say is like a really truly meaty moment was the Demise and Vestige, the fifth track, the Goliath track of just being over 15 minutes there. It reminds me of something, and every time I'm listening to it I'm like, this reminds me of something. And I don't know if it's a Metallica track or if it's another Dream Theater or Symphony X track, but it has that same kind of and I mean that type of presentation on a song, especially within the progressive metal track. It's kind of a go-to where you got like the two slower ones and then a quick succession, and a two slower ones and then a quick succession, comprising a 4/4 time. But that being very meaty, and I'm like, okay, this is where we're getting some good stuff here. The overall structure of this album doesn't lend itself to an overall cohesive whole. It does kind of feel as a train of thought, and it doesn't feel like a very well-rounded package. And this might just be the time period, the band. I mean, this is still their second album, so they are still kind of finding their feet. So it could have just been growing pains, and I haven't really listened to any other material. So I don't know, again, if it's just stepping out of the novice and starting to work their way more into a master of their own domain. But I feel like with a little bit more time, they can really stretch that out, because this is probably why the album felt so long, because I thought this album was like an hour and 20 minutes or the 80-minute length, and I was surprised that this was half the time. In some cases, this is great because, you know, when an album is good, you want to spend a lot of time with it, but at the same time, when an album feels a lot longer than it actually is, that's a knock against it. Overall, I kind of been debating back and forth whether this is a stream or if it's a download, and I know a lot of people are going to be for ranking it so low, so I'm going to split the difference as I usually do within this type of thing and say download this album just for the cultural significance of this. This album really helped shape progressive metal moving forward. It undoubtedly helped influence bands and albums to come as well. So I would recommend going in, having some fun with it, and finding out if this is your thing. Download it. It's a great album to return to. So that's about it for The Towers of Avarice by 0 Hour. What did you guys think? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Let me know of your own thoughts about this album by commenting down below. Also, a huge thank you to Matthew for donating to my Patreon and suggesting this album for me to review. Had a great time diving in. So if you want to suggest an album for me to review, if there's an album that you're dying to hear my thoughts on, consider donating to my Patreon and force me to do it. That's what Matthew did. And I'm going to be reviewing some other albums that patrons had suggested that kind of go back into the past, and I'm really excited to dive into those guys. So thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.